Okay, hi everyone, I'm Justin Barker. I'm the ED of the Youth Coalition of the ACT, but I come from a research background. As Will pointed out, I've been an academic for the last 14 years or so, and before that I was a youth worker at Bernardo's and in Adelaide before that as well. So I'm really going to be presenting the evidence from the ivory tower, really, not from the worker experience. I was never a DV worker. I was a homelessness worker and worked with youth, young homeless people, and had the privilege of doing an ethnography of youth homelessness as well. So I spent 18 months on the streets with young people living in their lives. And one of the things that I was reflecting on this with Will the other day, that while I was doing my field work, I spent maybe the first 10 months of my field work not as a parent. And I have to say, children were relatively invisible to me. It's like it wasn't really on my radar. And then I had my first kid whilst doing my field work on the streets of Canberra. And all of a sudden, babies appeared on my radar. And I started having conversations with women and men, young people who are homeless, that because I'd become a dad, they started having conversations with me. That before then, these young men would say to me, oh, actually, I'm a dad. And I'm like, what the hell? You're a dad? I've known you for years, and I had no idea that you were a dad, and the kind of experiences you came from and their parenting experiences. So it was a real interesting turning point for me as an experience to suddenly notice the baby in the pram crying that has no safe, quiet place to sleep. Mum started telling me how hard it is to steal nappies. Like, that's not what you can steal when you're on the street and you're roughing it. You can steal food, but you can't steal nappies. You can't stuff up your jumper and walk out. So all of a sudden, my cultural relativism as an anthropologist got kind of thrown into a disarray. There are some things that aren't culturally relative when it comes to kids about their need for sleep, their developmental delays, and the things that they need to survive. And I have to say the same things happen to me as an academic too. Is in the homelessness research space, we're very focused on some things and kind of not really paying much attention to the impact of family conflict and domestic and family violence on our clients, and then on them when they become parents and their children as well. So I have to say, only within the last, since 2013 when I did this report, it's really become, it's like all of a sudden, like someone tells you a word you've never heard of before, and all of a sudden you hear that word everywhere. It's like, wow, paucity, I never heard that word before. Now everyone's using it. DV is like that for me. It's been pointed out, and now I see it everywhere. And now it's become kind of one of those things that it pervades the homelessness sector, and we often don't think about it. So I'm really coming from that homelessness background and shifted towards this DV focus. And you'll see the difference in our presentations, because Wendy's a lot more practice-oriented and from that DV sector as well. What I'm going to be talking about today is the findings of a report I did back in 2013 funded by DSS. And the rationale behind this research project was exactly what I was talking about. In refuges and in the homelessness sector, we started seeing that DV and homelessness weren't really distinct problems. That people who are coming to the homelessness sector were more often than not affected by domestic and family violence to varying degrees. And people in the DV sector and domestic and family violence sector were often faced with homelessness to varying degrees. They almost became synonymous, but we weren't treating them as such. There was a real division in the way we dealt with these issues, which was reflected in the literature. So, and what became evident was that this wasn't a conversation. We weren't talking about children. So this research was really looking at what evidence do we have in the homelessness and DV sector, or combined, looking at positive outcomes for children. So any kind of positive outcome, psychosocial, material, educational, as long as there were outcomes reported for children, that was the explicit focus of the research. It was included in this literature review, and there wasn't a great deal to include. So what we found that is, despite the increasing evidence base about the harms of domestic violence and homelessness on children, that the service responses for children, specifically aimed at children, were still very limited, despite this increasing evidence base of the harms. We also know that there's an increasing awareness of, and over the last few years, there has been a little bit of a culture shift into, we're talking about it now, to get children on the radar of practitioners and think about, is this client a parent? Do they have children? What are the needs of these children? Despite that increased awareness, at least at a sector level, this hasn't been matched by an increase in resources and funding to explicitly address these issues or in changes in policy. So most services are not resourced to look after children, to focus on them. And if they are, they're usually not adequately resourced. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the impact of homelessness and DV as it appears in the literature, and then talk about the problems with that kind of conceptual division. And it's important to recognise that when we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about unsafe and insecure and unstable accommodation. This isn't just the really pointy end of the people we see on the street with a trolley or, camping out. This is unsafe, unstable and insecure accommodation, and this is the impact of it. So they might be in a house that's just not stable. They might be couch surfing. And it's really important to not kind of reduce it to that more extreme end of homelessness when we're thinking about what causes these harms. So this is the impact on children, not the parents. It affects their physical health and their mental health, increasing stress and anxiety. It affects their family relationships. Not only have they come from often family conflict and DV, but the pressures and strains of homelessness exacerbate family conflict and those parenting concerns. It's harder to parent and to have a good relationship with your children or partner under the conditions of homelessness because it increases that strain. For children, there are increased likelihood of missing years in school. It's not just actually missing the school years, it's that disengagement from school, which obviously the earlier it happens, the harder it is to get back. And what we see in the youth sector is that we need to make sure kids stay engaged with that social environment around those other pro-social peers for as long as possible. But homelessness, in part because of the mobility, but in part because of the instability, even in situ, that undermines their engagement in school. There's a greater risk of developmental and language delay amongst preschoolers who are affected by domestic and family violence. And there's that community disengagement. Again, children become less engaged with other people in their communities because it's harder for them to do that. Because of, the stress and the mobility and the moving around. So now I want to talk about the impact of domestic and family violence as it's mentioned in the literature. And it's really important to highlight that DV can affect children's lives through a range of ways. They can be directly experiencing and seeing the violence, either as the victim themselves or in the presence of it, and the controlling behaviours. They can hear it in another room and know that it's going on. You hear stories about young people being in a room and knowing that there's this stuff going on in another room. These are all different versions of the way that you have these negative impacts. There's seeing the aftermath the next day, whether it's physical or it's in the house. And it's that hostile environment too, and the way that hostile environment not only impacts the child directly, but it can impact the parent's ability to parent. So a child might not know that this is going on, but my capacity to parent has been limited because of the domestic and family violence situation I'm living in. That walking on eggshells about someone else's behaviour, what's going to happen, and the fear, and how that can undermine my capacity to parent. So all of these ways of being affected by domestic violence can lead to emotional and behavioural issues for children and young people. And I've got a list of some of these just to unpick it because it doesn't kind of do it justice saying emotional and behavioural issues. It can inhibit a child's ability to trust or to have a sense of safety and security. It's a decreased level of social competence for children who have been living in a domestic and family violence situation. Increased rates of internalising behaviours such as fearfulness and anxiety, higher rates of low self-esteem, and more externalising behaviours such as aggression and lack of self-control. And though the research findings vary at a population level of people affected by domestic and family violence, some children who are exposed to violence are more likely to later become victims or perpetrators of domestic violence. So obviously working with this population group as early as possible is an important part of breaking that cycle, and Wendy kind of talks more poetically about that kind of impact. So as I said, that's really what the research tells us about what's the impact of homelessness and what's the impact of domestic and family violence. But DV and homelessness have been referred to by Spinney, Angela Spinney she's from Victoria too, isn't she? The double whammy of disadvantage. That very rarely do they not go hand in hand. And in some ways, talking about this is the harms of homelessness and this is the harms of DV is a bit of a misnomer, because if we think of homelessness as being unsafe, insecure and unstable, then by virtue of being in an environment where there's domestic and family violence, which is unsafe, insecure and unstable, you're kind of experiencing the impacts of homelessness too. So, and that's why it's important to stress, we're not talking about living on the street, we're talking about insecurity, instability and uncertainty and chaos and the impact of that. Now, it's also really important to acknowledge that this is a gendered issue, that overwhelmingly children and women are entering the homelessness sector and the DV sector. It is, in Australia, homelessness for families and children is predominantly a DV issue, a domestic and family violence issue, not just about poverty or housing affordability, though increasingly it is. It is about domestic and family violence. There's an interesting piece of research done in 2016 looking at the different populations of people, this is in the States, we have to keep that in mind, of people accessing refuges and shelters for homelessness and for DV, to look at how different or similar are these population groups. And the research found that there are more similarities amongst these population groups than there were differences. The way they were being treated and what we were doing to them varied depending on how they entered the system, and probably not addressing all their needs. But the population was more similar than different. And I think that's an important thing to remember. My old boss, Morag McCarthy, is saying it's the same people. It's the same people, just in different areas of the sector. That's my don't put this on Facebook. Morag. She's never seen my Morag impersonation before. So yeah, I know. We'll skip that bit, Tom. Now, in the research, it's really clear. The research highlights a very conceptual division. These siloed sectors. This is what we do in the homelessness sector, and this is what we do in the domestic and family violence sector. At the time of doing this report, that was more than just a conceptual and theoretical division. There was a cultural division, different conceptual lenses of homelessness and domestic and family violence. They work differently, they are thinking of things differently. And there's another piece of research in this literature review that highlighted how some women make this decision about, I'm affected by DV and homelessness, but how do I think of this as my problem? It makes me decide, do I want to enter the homelessness sector or do I want to enter the DV sector? And a lot of it came down to these perceptions of what this meant to be in the DV sector. Am I a survivor or am I to be blamed? Am I hit rock bottom financially? Or there were all these different kinds of decisions associated with stigma and assumptions about these sectors that informed where you went, which then in turn meant that you were kind of received a certain response. So I'm going to talk now about the underpinning assumptions of what works in the two sectors and how they really need to come together. The homelessness sector and homelessness research, and this is reflected in the sector pretty strongly, has an underpinning theory that what we're here to do is provide them with stable housing. That's our core goal in the homelessness sector. We might do financial stuff and living skill stuff. That's all there to really supplement and enable stable housing. And this colloquial assumption in the homelessness sector is supported by evidence. A lack of housing not only has an effect on the well-being of the family, but also limits the capacity to make positive changes and engage with services and other supports. So, families who do receive appropriate and adequate housing are often able to significantly improve their health, social and educational outcomes. That's a bit of a problem if there's no housing available that's permanent, just in case you didn't know. However, housing alone isn't enough, both within the homelessness sector and very much so for those families affected by domestic and family violence. A lot of the research about housing first and rapid rehousing in the DV sector that shows, given the stable housing they'll be fine, within the homelessness sector, comes from the US. As I said before, the US is different from Australia. With no welfare system in the US, homelessness for women and children is predominantly about housing affordability and income. It's not necessarily about domestic and family violence. It's not necessarily about drug and alcohol, mental health issues and things like that. In countries where there's more extensive welfare systems, the homelessness system is more complex. The homelessness population are more complex. In Australia, as I said, homelessness for families is predominantly a DV issue. And just providing housing is not enough, and that's quite clear in the research. Necessary, but not sufficient. In the DV sector, there are a range of therapeutic interventions in the evidence of how people try to attain positive outcomes for children. There's a range of targets. We have interventions that directly work with the children. We have interventions that directly work with the mother or carer, predominantly the mother. And then we have interventions that work with the mother and child. And the strongest evidence at the time of doing this review was for interventions that do concurrent mother-child interventions. And I'll get back to that in a minute. However, most interventions are just with the mother in the DV sector and not necessarily targeting their needs as a parent or thinking about their children's needs. There is this prevailing trickle-down assumption that if I work with the mum and help her in her stability and just help her, that will have an ongoing kind of, you used to call it osmosis, that yesterday was a good way, that therefore the needs of the child would be met. And that isn't very strongly supported by evidence in terms of outcomes for the children. And this is in part an assumption, a kind of a theoretical assumption that kind of pervades the DV sector. However, to be fair, the DV sector also knows they need to be working with the children, except they're so stretched with resources that they're having to prioritise keeping heads above water of the mother. It's kind of like the in the plane, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before on the kid. Unfortunately, there aren't enough oxygen masks to go around in Canberra, so we're just giving it to the mums. So now I'm going to talk about what it is we need to do to ensure positive outcomes for children as a sector based on the evidence. So the first bit is about a shift towards thinking family, increasing focus on thinking about parents, thinking about adult clients as parents and the needs of children. So not just addressing them as an adult, but thinking about what are your parenting needs and how can I support you in this parent-child relationship, and also what are the child's needs. Again, Dorothy Scott was encouraging people to think family and the whole sector to shift, have this cultural shift towards thinking family. And she kind of created this spectrum for services to kind of map themselves out. There's a range of responses. The narrow focus is children are not my concern and families. My core business is working with the adult. I'm not even going to think about it. And as we move down, I'm somewhat more broad, and I'm aware that there are children out there, but someone else is going to do it, so I'll refer them on. And we move down to families and children are part and parcel of my job. And Dorothy Scott and a whole bunch of other people, including myself, think the whole sector need to shift their focus down here. It doesn't necessarily mean you've all got to become a specialised service, but we all need to shift our focus down, increasingly down towards thinking family more appropriately. And this really involves, for most people, most services, to an increased commitment of doing child-centred practice. Now, child-centred practice is one of these things, I was saying this yesterday, that we want child-centred practice we're giving a voice to child's experience, but that's often just listening. Like, we don't need to just listen to what children are saying. We need to involve children in decision-making and planning and have that actually affect what we're doing and actually have it lead to some kind of response to address their needs. The research with children has shown that their experience and the impact on them and the way they perceive challenges is different, and we really need to think of them as clients in their own explicit focus. Have I skipped too far? No, I haven't. So while there's some disagreement about what being child-centred means, these are some of the points where there is agreement in the literature about what being child-centred means. One of the things I love about Wendy is you talk about the infant focus too, because I'm really talking 12 and under. This is the age group that I'm talking about, but there are differences within that range, developmental and a range of things, and Wendy will talk about that really. However, the principles of child-centred practice are, as I said before, recognising the child as a client in their own right, and being committed to that family-centred practice, and involving them in decision-making. It means engaging with children, and that means sometimes getting down and playing with them and interacting with them explicitly rather than ignoring them. Giving children reassurance that they're not alone, responsible, or to blame. This is another key component of child-centered practice. Expressing genuine empathy. It's like treating them like a human. Who would have thought? It sounds so bizarre. Working at the level appropriate to the child's developmental capabilities. And it's interesting, we did a survey recently with Families ACT about case management in the CYFSP, and it became abundantly clear that everyone needs to have some increase, not everyone, the sector would like to be lifted in their capacity in the understanding of developmental needs of children. We need to check children's understanding of events, and we also need to think about trauma-informed approaches for children as well, specific to the children's needs. Okay, so that's the first thing. Think family, shifting towards child-centered practice. And then there are some therapeutic considerations, and this is where I come back to that kind of false division between stability and therapeutic interventions or psychosocial interventions. If we give someone a house, that does increase the likelihood of them being able to think about doing psychosocial needs and address their therapeutic needs. However, just giving them a house and not doing that can undermine the stability of their housing. We really need to embed therapeutic and psychosocial supports within more holistic case plans. So we are addressing these concurrently. And this is supported by the cumulative harm research that says almost across the board that we are better off treating the diverse needs of our clients concurrently rather than going, let's do them this first, and once they've succeeded in that, step them up to the next level. Now we'll think about psychosocial stuff. Now we're at a different place. You have better outcomes across the board if we do concurrent therapeutic and kind of material needs at the same time. This happens in the drug and alcohol sector, mental health sector, DV and homelessness sector. Of course, one of the great barriers to doing this is that it's hard to provide stable housing. But there's this strange logic of they haven't got stable housing yet, so let's not do the other thing. Ideally, we want to do them concurrently for the best outcomes, but we don't necessarily have to step people through this linear approach of progressing through the support that we offer them. The primacy of relationship. The evidence quite clearly points out across the qualitative and quantitative research that relationships are central to not only facilitating good outcomes, but actually attain good outcomes. And when we talk about relationship-centered practice, we often just say that, yeah, we're relationship-oriented, relationship-centered. Like, well, what do you mean by that? Because it means a lot of things. It means the relationship between the mother and child is important, but the relationship between the child and the worker and the mother and the worker are important. There's a whole bunch of relationships here that there's modelling going on, and we need to think about these relationships with a kind of sincerity. Yesterday's conversation, we were talking about the importance of continuity of a worker. Of how if you have a worker for a short period of time and go to the next person, this undermines the outcomes. Because trust is a scarce commodity amongst people whose lives have been affected by domestic and family violence and or homelessness. And if someone have developed that trust with someone and developed that relationship, we need to maintain that. We need to invest in that. Because it leads to the transformative nature of relationships, as how the research puts it. Given the need for parents and children affected by conflict to learn to trust and develop new and sustainable relationships, modelling this through interactions with work is paramount. And again, we have structural barriers to maintaining those relationships and creating them. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, we need to be able to collaborate. When you break down the silos we have between these sectors, there are a lot of prevailing assumptions that have some truth to them about the differences between the DV and the homelessness sector. People think that the DV sector is still very focused very narrowly, and it's not. They're very, very broad. They're working with men. They're aware that women can also use violence. They're wanting these relationships to work. They know that women don't always want to leave a relationship. The DV sector isn't the same way it was. It's really moved on. But similarly, the DV sector has some assumptions about the homelessness sector that are out of date. The homelessness sector has moved on. They are having to address psychosocial needs because we've got no houses to give them to. We're having to do other things to improve outcomes for these clients because we can't exit them to houses. So we've had to lift our game too by virtue of necessity. So we need to break down these silos. We need to really think about, is this housing going to the housing sector or the DV sector? It's like, who cares? We need more housing. We need more housing. We might want to think about triaging those needs so that people with children are prioritised because of the benefits you get from supporting those children in the short term and long term. But I think we can all agree on these things. So partnership and collaboration is still a problem, and I still see this within Canberra as well. Screening and assessment is another thing that is really important. And when we're talking about affecting a cultural change, when I evaluate programs around the place in the ACT and in Australia, very rarely is there a clear screening and assessment process of clients. And I'm not asking for validated and reliable assessment. I'm merely asking for services to consider whether their clients are a parent and ask them, what was the way we worded it? It says, are you a parent? You said, do you have children? Do you have children? And if they say yes, then think, well, what are your needs as a parent or someone with children that I need to address? We don't even ask that question, especially in the homelessness sector. And we need to ask that across the board in the human services. And if they say yes, then have a conversation about it. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm not making this. I don't want this a bureaucratic thing. Just go, are you a parent? Yes. Are you Aboriginal? Yes. It's like it needs to provoke a conversation to consciously become aware of this aspect to enable a culture change. Our clients are often parents. They're often children of someone else who's they also want to be interact with as a child or young person. Or as you pointed out yesterday, we're all children of someone, and even the adults sometimes want to have an ongoing relationship with their parents. And I think the final step to improving practice in the sector is the need to lift the level of skills and training. And that may be across the board, that there is variable levels of training to deal with and address the needs of children and parents. Another thing that came out yesterday was how there's some fears of like, I don't work with kids and or parents. I don't know anything about that. And we might not be asking you to become a specialist. We might be asking you to become informed and become aware of this, to move down Dorothy Scott's spectrum towards becoming, this is on my radar, I'm aware of it, and I'm now going to refer them on. Or to even start having these conversations. A lot of the fears that people have about working with children is like, holy crap, am I really going to start considering their needs as well? A lot of those fears are allayed once people do training and start doing it. That it doesn't actually need to be as fearful as we think it is. And finally, again, I'll go to the last stage. There is a real need for us to see a culture change. But I want you to be aware that this culture change doesn't need to happen at the worker level and manager level. This happens to need at the government level too, because a lot of this needs to be facilitated by increased resources and funding that will allow us the time and space to do this work. If we're going to increase demands on workers, we need to be able to enable that. So this culture change needs to happen on the coalface, at the ground level, but it also needs to happen amongst managers and at a government level as well to change policy and resourcing. Finally, I just want to talk about what the service gaps are at the moment. And there are, at the moment, especially in Canberra, I don't know what the state of the rest of Australia is like, there is a lack of services explicitly and purposefully targeting children's outcomes. The outcomes for children are incidental at best, not even on the radar. There aren't many services to refer to or even go to ask questions. So this is a really big problem. There's a lack of family-centred homelessness services, so when people are in need and want to stay with their partner or with their children, there isn't a lot of space, let alone exit points, which I'll get to in a minute. Carer and child-centred approaches. Again, the most compelling research was with concurrent carer or mother and child, working with them both at the same time to address their needs. This is the most compelling research. And there's not a lot of that going on. There might be stuff with children, but it's not got a concurrent element working with parents. And of course, there are inadequate exit points. So when we're talking about people needing to be stable to effectively, retention in programs, therapeutic and psychosocial programs is hard when someone's homeless. And if we've got stable housing and we have stable exit points and we can just ease that for people's lives, then it's a lot easier to start doing those psychosocial interventions and therapeutic interventions as well. But this is a huge problem, the lack of exit points, and how that means people are staying in crisis accommodation and medium-term accommodation with children for a lot longer. And I'm hearing lots of stories from Nicole from the early morning centre about women and kids in cars for weeks on end because there aren't places for them to go. It's really quite horrifying when you hear the stories. And that's because there's no exit points from those people who are in this crisis and medium-term accommodation. And that is the end of my presentation. I think we're going to ask questions afterwards, and I think we're going to go straight on to Wendy. So, Wendy.